there's the copy or the URL of if you want a copy of this presentation. And actually, there's a lot of information on these slides, and so that's why I think it's important that you have access to that. When we're talking about weaning, weaning is basically taking the milk diet away from a young mammal. It could be, we usually think of it as we're separating the babies from their mom, and that's the most common type of weaning. But it's also, if you're a dairy operation and you're artificially raising those lambs and kids, it's when you take the milk away from them. If you've got a bottle lamb, an orphan lamb, when you cut his milk off, that you're weaning him. So it's not separation from the mother only, but that's the most common type of weaning in a meat and fiber operation. I look at those two little guys in that picture and say, it's time to be on your own. You need wean. You're big babies. I get this question a lot in emails. When should you wean kids or lambs? And it's like a lot of things I get asked. It depends. And it's not even a when you should. It's because we can wean baby lambs as early as 14 days. I'm not a big fan. I think that's pretty darn early. We can probably wean kids at 4 weeks. It's probably been done. I think that's pretty early. But it goes anywhere from 14 days to basically not weaning them. More than 6 months, more of a natural weaning, and kind of everything in between. I look at there basically being 3 ages to wean lambs and kids. Early, which I would define as less than 90 days. Late, which I would define as more than 90 days. And natural, which is you're not weaning at all. Now, when you wean early, that's a decision you have to make. Am I going to wean early? Am I going to wean late? Am I not going to wean at all? But there are circumstances where you're pretty much going to early wean. The first one is in a dairy sheep operation. There's a lot of different ways to manage dairy sheep. But one method is you leave the lambs on for the first month or so, and then you wean them. So you're weaning them pretty early. Of course, the other way is you take them off the doe or the ewe after 24 hours, say, and then you artificially rear them. Well, if you're doing that, or even in a meat and fiber operation, you have some orphans that you're artificially raising, then it's common to wean them at 6 to 8 weeks of age, which is early weaning. It is early weaning. And we're going to talk a little bit specifically about artificially reared lambs and kids because they are somewhat of a special case, but they're also pretty standard if you're a dairy operation or if you get very many animals that you have to bottle feed. If you have a lot of multiple births, this can happen. And the one thing I want to emphasize is there is no best time to wean. There's pros and cons to different ages and different systems. It needs to be what's appropriate for your circumstances and your production system. Again, if you're a dairy sheep enterprise, you're not going to let them stay on the moms for too long because you won't be able to get much milk. So it has to be appropriate for your circumstances and your production system. And there's a lot of different things you need to consider when you're making that decision of when to wean. Certainly the age of the babies, what season it is. We make different decisions based on when they were born. It's common to wean lambs born in the winter or kids born in the winter early. It's common to wean the ones born in the spring later. We have to consider the parasite problems that potentially they have. Will weaning hurt or help that problem? The predator risks. Will weaning hurt or help that risk? If it increases that risk, then we need to make sure we deal with that increased risk. We need to look at our markets. We need to look at how much labor we have available in the facilities we have. The more you separate animals, usually the more facilities you need, whether it's pens or pastures. And obviously, weaning takes some labor. Real important consideration is your feed resources, your forage availability. And really not even just how much pasture you have, but is it good quality pasture? Perfect example, in a drought year, it makes sense to wean them. It makes sense to wean them because the babies aren't going to get enough to eat. By separating them, you can make sure you increase their nutrition. A question about the age of the mother. I'll try to address that as I go through some of these slides. Hadn't really separated out the age of the mother, but I think there's a situation where we can talk about that. The other thing to keep in mind, even though we always talk about age, what's really more important than age, and of course this particularly comes into play if you want to wean early, is how big they are. It's not how old they are, it's how big they are. It's kind of the same as if you're breeding a ewe lamb or a doeling when they're less than a year of age. It's not so much how old they are, it's how big they are, how much they weigh. And here's just some standard recommendations. For lambs, 2 to 3 times birth weight. Now that's going to work for a lot of lambs, but you do got to keep that in perspective. Like one year I had a 2-pound lamb born. And believe me, when he was 6 pounds, he was not ready to be weaned. But if I had a 10-pound lamb born and I was artificially rearing that baby, then it'd be okay. Again, speaking of the artificially raised lambs, about 20 to 25 pounds is the recommendation. Not that you necessarily wean them. And I need to clarify that. These aren't necessarily that you should wean them. These are minimums. At least 2 to 3 times birth weight, at least 20 to 25 pounds. And these are primarily for the ones that are being fed milk replacer. And then if they're on the mother, if they're being raised by the dam, 40 to 50 pounds is the minimum that is often used. And again, you need to keep all these in perspective because you'll end up sometimes weaning a runt, really poor lamb when it's less than 40 pounds. That's certainly possible. We go over to the kid size. They don't grow quite as fast. So you typically see a recommendation of 2 to 2.5 times birth weight, 20 to 25 pounds for meat kids and dairy kids. Probably going to be somewhat different for pygmy goats or for Angora. So again, take these recommendations as kind of a grain of salt. They're just some really broad recommendations, minimums, minimum weights. What's really even more important than size is more important than age. What's even more important sometimes than size is that kid or lamb needs to be eating enough dry feed to support his maintenance and his continued growth with the absence of that milk diet. Typically that's about 1% of his body weight. So a 50-pound lamb, that's about a half a pound of creep feed or creep feed plus hay or whatever. So it's about 1%. The lighter ones is probably going to be a little bit higher than that. In fact, a half pound is kind of a good gauge of what they're eating. They have to be eating enough feed, drinking water, so that when that milk diet's taken away, they're going to be okay. They may have a little setback, but they need to be able to take care of themselves. Okay, let's talk about early weaning. I'm going to contrast early weaning with late weaning. And by early weaning, again, I mean less than 90 days, 14 to 90 days. I don't like that 14. I should take that out of there, but I do know people who have done it, and I do know some people have successfully done it. Usually we're talking more about 60 to 90 days. And that's pretty much where I fall into. I wean mine between 60 and 90 days, probably a little bit closer to 90, and some of the older lambs may even be a little bit above 90. Depends if I get things done when I intend to. The advantage of early weaning is you ease the lactation stress of a high-producing female. I look at weaning sometimes. People think of the stress of weaning. There's every bit as much stress on the dam when she's nursing. That's a stress to be concerned about too. And Steve had asked about these first-time moms. I think they're not only they may be a high-producing female, but they kind of fall in with the high-producing female. That lactation is high stress on them, and I would probably favor earlier. If I had to choose between early or late based on age, I would think there'd be better benefit to weaning the young moms and the older moms, even more important than the kind of the middle-aged ones. I remember one year I had a 11-year-old ewe raising a set of twins, doing a nice job. She was a bit arthritic. And I said, you know, those lambs are doing really well, and I just need to wean them for her sake. Because she'd done enough work, and it was hard on her, and they were doing just fine. I had another ewe that had quads, and I was bottle feeding 1.5 of them. And I weaned those at 6 weeks. So as soon as I weaned those at 6 weeks, she had 4 lambs pounding on her udder. And she was 10. So I also weaned her early because for her sake. When you wean early, you're kind of helping the prolific ewes raise their offspring. You mostly see early weaning with more productive flocks in terms of triplets. If you're doing accelerated lambing or kidding, or even if you just want your females to get in better body condition, the sooner you wean them, the more quickly they're going to recover. From the standpoint of the lambs and the kids, typically when we wean early, we creep feed them, and then we move them into a situation where they're eating grain and hay, or hopefully a really, really high quality pasture. And it's usually, particularly in the case of if they're in dry lot or being fed some grain, they've got less of a parasite problem, less of a predator risk when they're early weaned and fed out for market or for breeding. It's cheaper to feed the lambs and kids than it is to feed lambs, kids, ewes, and does. The lamb and the kid, the very young ones, make very efficient use of concentrates. It's much more efficient to feed that lamb or kid to grow than to feed that ewe or lamb to make more milk. Because the other thing you need to keep in mind is the ewe and doe's milk production is going to peak between 3, 4, 5 weeks after lambing and kidding. She's going to keep producing milk, and how long is going to depend on her breed and her genetics and your feeding, but she's going to peak relatively early, and that's another rationale for early weaning. Question was from Megan was, in the case of quads, do people wean to and leave to? That's going to depend quite a bit. I think there are certain ewes, I think they, or does, I think they need to be in their prime years of production, are probably capable of raising 4 if the nutrition is there. Now, you couldn't do that on straight forage. She'd need a lot of grain, in fact, almost unlimited grain. So what you kind of have to do is you look at that set of quads, you look at the health and vigor of the babies, you look at the mom and her milk supply, and you kind of evaluate what you think they can handle. And I can tell you I've had different situations. I've had a ewe with quads that I took one off. It was a weak one. It wasn't able to compete. I just took it off. I had another set of quads, the one I just mentioned, the older ewe, I left them all on. And anyone who wanted milk, which was basically 1.5 of them, one for the half for just about the first 4 weeks, and one pretty much complete. I left them on, and then I fed them while they were on them. So you can do it in a lot of different ways, and you kind of got to evaluate the situation. And as Dr. Escobar mentions in the chat box, you got to check the health of that udder. The very most important thing for a ewe or a doe is her udder. They're like an udder on legs. A ram is testicle on legs. I mean, those are the most important parts of their body. So she needs a healthy udder, and she needs to be really productive. And you have to evaluate between her milk production and the viability of those babies, whether you leave them on, take them off, and how you supplement them. And sometimes what's going to be easiest for you on labor. I like leaving them on so I don't have to be on a set schedule, that I know that all of them can nurse anytime they want, and maybe the one that's not getting enough, I'll be there to supplement it. Whereas if I take them completely off, I kind of feel like I'm obligated to a schedule. And I like to keep them bonded with their mom. So like I said, there's numerous advantages to early weaning. Numerous advantages. What's the negatives of early weaning? Everything has pros and cons. Absolutely everything in life. It is, when you actually wean and do this separation or remove the milk diet, it is stressful. It is stressful to both the females and to the offspring. I think it's debatable who it's more stressful to. I always think that the moms are happy to get rid of the little rugrats. They may answer them the first 24 hours and then it's pretty loud, but I think they're happy to get rid of them. But I can tell you, by the time I wean my babies, a lot of them are pretty good size. So I really do think they're happy to get rid of them. I've read places where it says it's far more stressful on the mother than the babies, but it just depends. There's certainly a greater risk of mastitis, which Jeff talked about in our last session, which is basically an infection of the udder when you wean early, because they are still producing milk. And the higher producing the females are, the more milk they're still producing when you wean. When I wean a ewe at 100 days sometimes, which would be my oldest lambs, that ewe's still producing milk. She's not producing near as what she was weeks and weeks ago, but she's still producing milk. Even if I weaned at 120 days, they're still producing milk. And again, it varies by the individual. It varies by the breed. Certainly the dairy goat breeds have the potential to milk much longer, as do the dairy sheep breeds. You do need more facilities and pastures or pens usually if you're going to early wean, because you're going to take one group or two groups and you're going to double, and you're going to have more groups. So you need, if you have one pasture or one pen, you should have more pens and pastures so you have some flexibility, but you are going to need more. And I'd be the first one to say that early weaning requires a higher degree of management. I'm not going to talk a lot about late natural weaning, because there is no management really to natural weaning. You're not doing anything. So early weaning, and the earlier you do it, is a higher degree of management. I think I told you last time I just came back from visiting the dairy sheep research farm in Wisconsin, and their lamb management is huge, because the babies are separated at 24 hours and they're put on milk replacement. It's a very sophisticated system. It requires a lot of management to be successful. And so early weaning requires a higher degree of management to be successful, in my opinion. It's not that later weaning doesn't, but you have these other considerations to need to manage. Where early weaning is typical is in a system that you are either an intensive or semi-intensive production system. You tend to be lambing in the winter, although not necessarily. You tend to be lambing inside a building, although not necessarily, but more commonly. You tend to have more prolific females, more twins and triplets, maybe the occasional set of quads. You're going to crete feed. Early weaning and crete feeding go hand in hand. They really do. Okay? Typically, although not always, you're going to feed the lambs and kids, whether that's keeping them in dry lot and feeding them grain, or maybe feeding them grain with some forage, whether it's in dry lot, hay and grain, or out on pasture with grain supplementation. It's usually a system where you're pushing for a faster rate of gain. And again, artificially reared lambs and kids, early weaning is definitely commonplace, and it's definitely the way to go. And we'll talk about those little guys specifically a little bit later. Again, dairy sheep, you're really forced into that early weaning. The lambs take too much milk. They do too much damage to the udder to leave them on for very long. Typically in dairy goats, they don't even get a chance. They're removed very soon after birth and artificially reared. If you're showing animals, obviously you're going to early wean, crete feed, and push for some pretty good performance. If pasture is a limiting factor, quantity or quality, early weaning makes a lot of sense. Again, getting back to the drought. Even people who would typically not wean or wean very late in a drought condition should probably wean, because in a drought condition, young growing animals are definitely not going to get what they need. And when they don't get what they need, not only are they not going to grow well, they're going to be more susceptible to parasites and any other disease problems that might be out there. I look at my situation where on my little farm, and I don't have a lot of pasture, so that's one of the reasons I choose to wean early, although it's not excessively early, but that's one of the reasons I choose to feed lambs some feed, because I don't have a lot of pasture. Other people are going to be in completely different circumstances. Okay, let's talk a little bit about these artificially reared lambs and kids. Bottle babies, bum lambs. Potty lambs, I think is what they call them in the UK. I thought that was really cute. This is a group of little Borgo kids that were being artificially fed on a bottle. Again, 6 to 8 weeks is optimal for these guys. But at the same time, they still need to be 2 to 3 times their birth weight and at least 20 to 25 pounds. So if you were feeding a little runt or one that wasn't performing really well, you know, that doesn't, you might keep him on the bottle longer than this 6 to 8 weeks. I try to, if I've got a bottle feed a lamb, I try to wean him right around 6 weeks. If I think he needs a little bit more, I'll sometimes go to 7 weeks. But the key on these guys is to get them eating creep feed, to get them eating dry feed. Because again, when you wean them, they need to be able to maintain themselves and continue to grow. So on bottle babies, you put that creep feed out for them immediately. I'm going to talk a little bit about what lambs and kids like to eat. But I'll tell you, when somebody's feeding bottle babies, I usually recommend they start with pure soybean meal. And I'll show you a table that, again, that shows what lambs like to eat. Your question might be, well, why not wean later? I mean, these are fragile. They've not had the good start like their siblings have. Some of them could even be compromised in terms of colostrum. Well, one of the main reasons we don't wean them later, because gosh, that milk replacer is expensive. Now, if you're a dairy goat farmer or something and that milk, you don't have an alternative, you don't have a market for an alternative use for it, you might say, well, I'll keep feeding them. And there's some justification for that. But then again, there's also the labor consideration. It takes, especially if you're hand feeding, it takes a lot of work to feed these little guys. And even if you're feeding them on a milk bar, you still have to mix milk and fill milk and keep the equipment clean. But probably one of the other important reasons of why you shouldn't do extended milk feeding of these guys is you're kind of just holding them back. Eating dry feed, eating grain, eating hay helps develop their rumen, and we need to do everything we can to encourage these babies to eat, and that includes the ones that aren't orphans, just the standard lamb and kid. We need to encourage them to eat as quickly as possible. That develops their rumen. They're born essentially with the same digestive system as you and I. The rumen and reticulum is not yet functioning. So they are a simple stomached animal. That's why they can only really utilize milk. As they start to nibble on things and eat things, they get that rumen going, and that's what we want them to do. So that's another reason why you shouldn't continue to offer them milk. I mean, sometimes I hear people still feeding an animal when they're 4 months old, and that's not doing them any good. And when you wean these guys, and when you wean, period, we're talking about weaning them abruptly. Don't give them diluted milk. Don't reduce their feedings. Usually, most times when you're bottle feeding, you give 2 bottles a day. Well, cut off. Once you do 2 bottles a day, cut it off. Like I said, do it abruptly. There's no reason to dilute the milk. It just makes no sense to dilute the milk. Just cut when it's time. Because when the ewe doesn't dilute her milk, the doe doesn't dilute her milk, we just separate them. So you're not doing any good. Are you doing any harm? Probably not necessarily, but there's just really no point in it. As I mentioned, early weaning goes right along with creep feeding. Again, same thing with these orphans, creep feeding. And creep feeding is just a way to supply supplemental nutrition to the nursing lambs and kids. Again, it's common with early weaning. It's common in flocks that have a lot of multiple births. It's common or very appropriate if you have more babies than you have milk. If milk production is a limiting factor in your flock for whatever reason, low levels of mastitis, poor milking sheep or goats, creep feeding makes a lot of sense. And what creep feeding is, you set up an area in the building or outside where the babies can get to and the moms can't. So the picture on the top is a picture of a creep gate inside my building, and those are the openings that the lambs can get through. The creep feeder at the bottom, I think that was an outside one at Delaware State University, a homemade one. Not sure that little goat can get out of there, but then I know goats and they can get through very tiny holes. And it's obvious this one probably got made and then the does kept getting in, so they kept adding more boards. And there's a lot of different ways to set up these creep panels. You can buy them. The one up top is a purchase creep panel. Hey, when that's the family business, that's the type of equipment you use. You can make them. A lot of people take those like stock panels you get at feed stores. and the animals will go through that. You can use a tire. You can be creative. You just basically want to create a way for lambs and kids to get in and the mom's not. You want to get this set up as soon as possible, but basically between a week and 10 days after the lambs and kids are born. It needs to be in a high traffic area where the lambs and kids are going to commonly go. Ideally, you have multiple openings. There's going to be some situations where you might have only one because that's just how you made it. But the more openings, the better. And it's good if the lambs and kids can see their moms so they don't think they're being separated. So good visibility, clean, dry, well-bedded, well-lit. A nice place. Kind of think of it as the mall for lambs and kids. A place they not only go to eat, but they like to hang out. They like to hang out. The question was about the feed, and that's what I want to talk about on this slide, creep feed. Again, that lamb and kid is not a ruminant when it's a baby. It needs small particles. It prefers small particles. It needs feed that's easily digested. Can't eat whole grains without a rumen. Needs things that ferment well. Needs feed that's fresh. Needs to be palatable. High protein. I would say a minimum of 16% protein. Many people will go above that. I'll usually have mine up around 22% when they first start. And I'll keep changing it. That's the advantage when you mix your own feed. You can keep changing it. If you buy a set feed, obviously you're going to feed whatever that set feed is. And it should always be available. Don't let it run out. The danger in letting it run out is overeating disease. Perfect example. Maybe not so much in the wee little ones, but once they start eating very much, they don't have any, and then when it's filled again, all of a sudden they go over there and gorge. So you want to have it always available, always fresh. If it gets a little bit stale or dirty, what I'll do is I'll scoop it out and feed it to the ewes. I'll always keep it clean and fresh. That's a picture of some of my lambs eating creep feed. I just mix cracked corn with soybean meal. That's how I start. And if you look at the table below, hopefully you can see this okay on your screen. This was a study done out at Wisconsin with the dairy sheep folks, looking at what lambs, and this is lambs, how different goats are, we can only speculate, but this is what they like to eat at each stage of their life, basically in that pre-weaning stage. And overwhelmingly, it is soybean meal. All the way across, soybean meal. The other thing, corn as they get older, they like alfalfa hay, but it does decline as they get older and start eating more grain. So that kind of gives you an idea. You don't want things like oats when they're very young. You don't, pellets as they get older are better, but really the smaller crumbles are the best when they're young. You know, that just gives you an idea what they like. Like I said, I'll just mix cracked corn and soybean meal. And then once they have functioning rumens, I'll start moving them over to what I feed the ewes, which is a barley and a protein pellet type ration. And what I start the lambs out on is not 100% balanced, because if you think of corn and soybean meal, they're not going to have all the minerals. Well, they're at that early age. They're not consuming a lot. They're basically just learning how to eat and get into the habit of eating. I'll have free choice minerals for them, but that ration early on is not balanced. As it gets to the older ages and they're consuming a lot more, it's very important that this ration be balanced. But like I said, in the beginning, they're learning to eat, and they're getting into the habit of eating. And God, they love soybean meal. Crumbles, like I'm just basically talking of really small particle feeds. Not a chicken product per se, but small particles. And if you think of cracked corn, they're very small particles. You know, you think of whole corn as a very large particle. The pellets, obviously you don't want real big pellets. When people have creep rations made, molasses is usually an ingredient in them to make them more palatable. This particular study was looking at very specific feed ingredients to see what the lambs like. If I was speculating on kids, I have creep-fed kids before, and I found them no different than lambs. And logically, certainly all of the animals find soybean meal to be palatable. A question about alfalfa, orchard grass, or grass hay. Of course, this study apparently just looked at alfalfa hay. That would probably be the most palatable for them, just like it is for the ewes. If you have good quality grass hay, nice fine stem, that's going to be good too. The one interesting thing I learned about hay in creep areas from the folks in Wisconsin was they found that once they weaned those lambs early, like at 30 days, they didn't want them on hay because they found that if they weaned them and the lambs could eat hay, they would eat too much of the hay and not really get enough dry matter to support their growth. So you'll find differing opinions on hay. And as Roy and Robin are mentioning, the protein level of alfalfa hay, of course, is going to be much higher. But really, it's the grain that you want them to eat, and especially, and they're going to get a lot of protein out of that soybean meal. Let's switch over to late weaning, and I'm just basically going to define that as over 90 days. The number one thing I think is good about it is you are getting closer to a more natural system of what would naturally occur with these animals. It's less stressful to the dams and to the offspring. And of course, to some degree, that's going to depend on whether late weaning is 100 days or whether late weaning is 150 days. You have less risk of females developing mastitis, particularly as that weaning date moves further out. Because again, at 100 days, they're still producing a lot of milk. But if you wean that same female at 50 days, there's a big difference as well. Typically, late weaning, we keep the babies with their moms on forage, on pasture, and we can take advantage of that forage. And typically, the weight that they gain on forage is cheaper than what they gain on grain. Now, this depends. I mean, if half of them die of parasites, that's certainly not going to be true. But generally speaking, pasture is something that has the potential to be much cheaper. From a labor standpoint, you can manage that whole herd as one. You know, one guardian dog or whatever, one water trough, one, you know, everything's one. You're checking on one group of animals. So that requires less effort. What are the negatives of late weaning? Well, the babies, the voice is going in and out. Anybody else let me know if you're having that problem. Although, honestly, I can't do anything with it except talk up louder. And maybe that's the problem. Maybe I go up and down sometimes. The negative of late weaning is the lambs and kids have to compete with mom for forage. They have to compete with her. They're getting the same feed as well. They're more likely to become parasitized for two reasons. In a late weaning system, we're more likely to have them on grass without supplementation, and the ewes are depositing eggs that's becoming infected larvae that the lambs are exposed to. The predator risk may be higher as well because, again, we've got them out on pasture with their moms. Depending on when late weaning occurs, depending on your breed, depending on your species, depending on when you market, you may need to castrate the males or separate them. Goats are very precocious. Personal opinion, if you wanted to wean past 90 days, I would castrate them or wean the males and not the females. Sheep, if it's a precocious breed like hair sheep or fin sheep, again, I would want to castrate if they were going to be on there for longer periods of time. The late maturing breeds, you might get away with not castrating. Again, it's going to depend on when you market. Late weaning is common with a more extensive production system or a semi-extensive. Later lambing, spring lambing, pasture lambing, although again, not necessarily pasture lambing. You could shed lamb but move to pasture. Less prolific ewes and does. That doesn't mean they don't have twins, but typically when you late wean, you don't want 3 babies on mom. Can't trust bucklings past 7 weeks. Yeah, I agree. Is the only reason to separate the males to not allow them to impregnate does. That's certainly the major reason, but also I think it's kind of a harassment too. You're going to affect performance and rate of gain if the males are constantly harassing the females. You're not going to get a fertile pregnancy from a 7-week-old buck, but you're going to get the behavior. And so it's kind of a judgment call on your standpoint. So You're typically in late weaning, although not always, you're not going to be creep feeding. This is a pasture-based operation. You have abundant pasture, hopefully good quality pasture, and that's why you're choosing to raise sheep and goats this way, and that's why late weaning fits into this production system. Now, you could creep feed, and creep feeding we think of as feeding grain, like you see in the creep feeder on the right. That's a creep feeder set up on pasture. I had an early set of lambs last year, and I kept them out on pasture, and I creep fed them on pasture. But we can also creep graze them on pasture. The picture on the left is a picture from New Zealand, and you can see they have a creep gate in the fence so that lambs can go to the better quality pasture. It's hard to tell from the picture which is better quality, but the lambs can go to the better quality pasture. The purpose of creep feeding, whether it's grazing or concentrates, is to try to improve their rate of gain, get them to grow faster, perhaps get them to market earlier, which could be an advantage. Now, whether this is a profitable practice is going to vary by farm, by species, by year. Grain feeding is probably more likely to be beneficial to lambs. It's more likely to be beneficial in a year that you don't have good forage. Again, maybe not a drought, but maybe a dry year. It's going to depend a lot upon your pastures. If you're creep grazing them but not really giving them access to a lot better pasture, it might not accomplish too much. But the one thing I want you to keep in mind is if they're on better nutrition, whether that's pasture or supplement, particularly higher in protein, that can help with parasites, particularly the barber pole worm, which is the primary parasite in a warm, moist climate like Maryland in the summertime and similar places. The other advantage is in creep grazing is that pasture, by not having the ewes on it, it should have less worm contamination. Creep grazing has had a lot of different results when they've done research with it. It's kind of getting a renewed interest in countries that graze a lot, like New Zealand and the UK. They're feeling that it's definitely a way to increase gains. But there's also studies sometimes that show that it hasn't done much to increase gains, or the gains are very variable, and I think that's because there are a lot of variables involved, especially the nature and quality of the pasture. The creep feeding with grain is almost always pretty much guaranteed to increase the rate of gain. The question is it an economical rate of gain? And that's something you have to ask for yourself. No matter when you wean, you would like it to be as less stressful for lambs, kids, their dams, hey, and even you as possible. Well, certainly, as we've been talking about creep feeding, it does lessen the stress of weaning. Certainly if you're going to do early weaning, but maybe even kind of late weaning, but early on the late side. It's important that you wean the moms from the babies, not the other way around. In other words, the lambs and kids need to stay in familiar surroundings and in the same groups. Don't separate male and female offspring on the same day that you wean. Keep them in the same groups, keep them with their siblings, keep them where they've been, and move the moms. You want to reduce the stress on the most fragile part of the equation, which is the babies. Remember, the moms are probably happy to get rid of the little rugrats. The stress that they're experiencing isn't going to affect their health. The stress that the lambs and kids could potentially experience could affect their health and viability. Don't change what the lambs and kids are eating drastically before or after weaning. Keep it the same. Again, they've lost their mom. They don't have milk in their diet. Keep as much as you can the same. When you have to do things to the lambs, whether it's vaccinations or anything else, don't do it the same time you wean. Weaning is enough of a stress. Do it before, do it after. Don't do it at the same time. In cattle, they've done research with fence line weaning, and all I mean by that is the calves and the cows can see each other and they have contact with each other visually. They can't nurse. I don't think there's been any research done with that to see if that reduces the stress on lambs and kids. I don't know. I know myself, I typically fence line wean just because that's the way my facilities are, is they can poke their head in, and Fortunately, they can't poke their head in and nurse, but they can poke their head in and touch their mom. Little picture on the lower right corner is another way you could actually, if this was really important to you, you felt it was a welfare issue, or for whatever reason you did not want to separate, but you wanted to early wean, but you kind of didn't. They have these devices you stick in their nose. I don't think that looks too great to me, but they do it, and it's probably pushed more on cattle than it is on sheep and goats. I don't even know if they make them for goats, but basically it just prevents them from suckling. And you can Google that on the internet if you want to see what it is. I think it's an Australian company, but a lot more emphasis on low stress weaning in cattle. I don't know if it's because it's a bigger industry or because it's more stressful for calves, knocks them back more. I really don't know. I have a colleague out at Langston who's proposing to do a study looking at low-stress weaning with kids. It'll be interesting to follow that if he's able to go through with that. I think a lot of us, as we're around these animals, we kind of get a feeling for what we need, or what we think is stressful and what we can do to keep stress to a minimal, simply by observing our animals and observing how they handle it afterwards. There are some things you need to do before weaning, and the earlier you wean, the more important these things are, but not necessarily only important for early weaning. And we've talked about this in some of the other sessions, but the CD and T vaccinations, Coccidiosis, which is a protozoan parasite, certainly can affect the pre-weaned baby, but I'll tell you it's actually more of a problem as they get a little bit older. As is type D overeating as they get a little bit older, young but older, and around that kind of weaning age. And then, of course, the management of the female herself. How are we going to manage her prior to weaning? The CD and T vaccinations, we covered this in the second session, but kind of just as a reminder, CD and T stands for Clostridium perfringens type C and D, which are basically overeating disease, with D being the classic overeating disease, C being the one that affects them in the first month of age. So D being the one that's more important from the standpoint of weaning. And then tetanus, T for tetanus. So what we should do, of course, we mentioned before, is vaccinate the moms before they lamb and kid, 4 to 6 weeks before they lamb and kid. 2 shots if they've never been vaccinated, otherwise an annual booster. We want to vaccinate the lambs and kids with the CDT toxoid, same thing we gave the mom, at approximately 6 and 10 weeks of age. That 6 could be 8 weeks and the 10 could be 12, but approximately that. Ideally, we'll get at least one, if not both of those vaccines done before weaning. Obviously, if you wean at 50 days, you're not going to get both of them done before then. If the dam was not vaccinated, which does happen, we don't always get it done, we can give the vaccine earlier to our lambs, but really giving them much more than 4 weeks is probably not going to have the same effect, so basically 4 and 8 weeks of age. Again, ideally before we've weaned, so that they've got full protection from type C overeating disease as they're weaned and they begin eating more dry feed. If we castrate, dock, or disbud, and all of those things are likely to be done in the first 2 weeks of age, if the mom wasn't vaccinated, we should use the tetanus antitoxin. If the dam was vaccinated, that lamb and kid are going to be protected when those early processes are done. Coccidiosis. This can be a major problem, particularly in animals that have some degree of confinement, but at the same time it is so easy to duplicate confinement situations out on pasture as animals congregate around mineral feeders, water, or bedding areas. So coccidiosis is a risk no matter how you raise your sheep. The recommendations I have here came from a fact sheet that I've recommended, I think, in one of the emails. The fact sheet was written by Joe Rook, who's a retired veterinarian from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, very highly regarded in the sheep industry. It is for lambs, but I don't think it would be any different for kids. So there's 2 ways to go about having a good coccidia prevention program in place. The first is to use the coccidiostats, and they can be in the feed, they can be in the water. Bovatec in the United States is approved for sheep. Rumensin is approved for goats. Decox is approved for both species. Bovatec and Rumensin are typically You mix them in the feed, or you buy a feed that has them, or you buy a mineral that has them. Decox, you can actually buy the ingredient itself and actually mix it into your own trace mineral salt. What's important, and we've talked about this before, rumensin is highly toxic to the entire equine family. Definitely don't probably even use it if you have horses. But really, you don't want to give any horse or related species any access to these coccidiostats. Bovatec and Decox are not labeled to be toxic to equines, but nonetheless, you don't want them to have access to it. If you don't want to go the mineral or feed route, and maybe this is because of the horses on the farm, you can use the water. Use a product called Amprolium or Corid. I'm sorry, my phone just rang, and I deliberately hung up on them after one ring. Wasn't that bad? I should have put the phone in the kitchen, and I forgot to. Corid or Amprolium, not approved for sheep and goats. Technically supposed to have a veterinarian involved for its use. If you will excuse me, my phone keeps ringing, and I'm going to move it. I apologize for that. The machine can kick in, but I had a feeling they were going to keep calling until they got me. Back to the Corid. Ideally, you want to put it in the drinking water so that you don't have to drench each and every one. There gives the mixing instructions for it. Dr. Rook recommends 21 days, so that's a long period of time that you would be doing that. The alternative is to drench the lambs and kids for 21 days. That's a lot of work. I guess that's why I favor the use of the coccidiostats. But if that's not viable, Corid is another alternative. Drying off the females is incredibly important. Again, the earlier you wean, but doesn't mean it's not important if you wean past 90 days. If you're in a fairly intensive system where you're feeding grain and hay and protein and all that, you want to start cutting the grain and protein out of that ration 1 to 2 weeks before weaning. If you Google this on the internet, you'll find a lot of different things of what people do in terms of the exact number of days that they do something, but basically you want to take the grain out of the ration. I'll take the protein out first, then I'll take the grain out. And then eventually you'll take, say you're feeding a pretty good hay, you'll replace it with not so good hay. And then a couple of days before weaning, you really want to make sure you're feeding a low-quality hay, even straw. And the whole issue is you are trying to shut down milk production. You are trying to shut it down. The lambs and kids are still suckling, so they're still pushing for milk production, but from a nutritional standpoint, you're trying to shut it down. Is Bovatec given to just lambs or mom also? Technically, Bovatec is only FDA approved to give lambs in the feedlot, technically. But by feeding it to the ewes, we are reducing the amount of coccidia in the environment, which helps reduce the amount that the lamb and kid is exposed to. So typically, you feed it to the ewes and the does a month before lambing and kidding. But technically, if you read the labels, they're approved for animals in feedlots. Is a coccidiostat absolutely required? Absolutely required? No. It's another issue of risk management. Coccidiosis can be a very common problem in sheep and goats and can be quite devastating, and it's just one of these ideas that an ounce of prevention is worth an, I forgot the saying. It's whether you feel like you want to prevent. It's the same thing with vaccinations. Are they absolutely required? No. They're a means of managing potential risk. Of course, the other thing that helps prevent coccidiosis is good sanitation. Good sanitation. And the problem with good sanitation is you can hopefully control a lot of that, but sometimes the weather makes it hard for you to do. So sometimes no matter how good a job you do, you can still create environmental conditions that can help spread coccidia. Back to the female. The other thing that's commonly done, and I have a question mark next to it, but is very often people will restrict their water. I've known people to take water away from the female. I'm more inclined to recommend that you restrict it. And what that might mean is instead of leaving water out 24 hours a day, you allow them to drink water twice a day or something like that. And I think the restriction in water also depends on when weaning occurs. Restricting water in March is considerably different than restricting water when it's hot out or whatever your weather may be. But that is another way to try to reduce that milk production. And so you want to continue feeding this low-quality forage for several days. I usually keep my girls in for 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Watch for Always keep an eye on the females to make sure you don't see engorged udders or signs of mastitis and signs of problems that might have to intervene. What about a female who lost her baby and is being milked? It's kind of the same philosophy. You're either going to milk her to her milk supply is too low to worry about milking, or you're going to also try to reduce her milk production. If she's milking pretty good and you decide you've had enough milking of her, then you would go through a similar process as what's right here. And one thing you don't want to do is if a female's udder is engorged, I'm not saying you don't try to get milk out of it at all, but there are other things you can do. But the more you milk or putting the kids or lambs back in, that does stimulate milk production. You know, it's not just the good nutrition that does, is also, it's just like a female that has twins versus a single, that twins is going to cause her to produce more milk. So there are other factors besides nutrition, but our goal when we're trying to dry off a female that's still producing some milk is we want to try our best to halt milk production. And it'll take really probably a month or two before that udder really starts to dry up. So that's why I say you want to keep an eye on them. You know, there are things that you can do when you've got some problems. The mastitis treatment that we talked about, the one called today, tomorrow is the other one that's actually for drying off females. I wouldn't necessarily routinely use antibiotics, but should there be a problem, that is an option. Again, it's not FDA approved for sheep and goats, and you should work with a veterinarian on that. What did you have on your oatmeal yesterday? Oh, the milk. Okay. All right, just about through here. Last thing I want to talk about is, okay, you got them weaned, now what do you do with them? Do you take them to the market, or do you keep them for further feeding or grazing? There's no right answer to this question. It's going to depend on your market, going to depend on what the current prices are, what you think prices are going to be, what feed resources you do have available, and what it would cost to put additional gain on your animals. This is going to be totally dependent on the farm, dependent on the year. And hopefully you're doing what makes you the most money. This is a picture of my lambs last year. I do keep them and put more weight on them. When I wean them, they're pretty good size, but I'll continue to feed them and get them up to some heavier weights. And that just seems to be what works for me. For others, being able to sell them right after weaning is the best for them, is their maximum profitability. So you just have to figure out what works for you. And what do you do with her after you've weaned her? Well, if after you've weaned that you determine that the female has a problem, perhaps she has mastitis or a touch of mastitis, perhaps she's getting pretty old, doesn't have any teeth left, or she's arthritic, or let's say she failed to produce an offspring at all, or you have a productive herd and all she ever has is singles. Well, you should call them and you should get rid of them, especially with these high prices. And as I talked a little bit about before we started, if they're on the thin side, it may pay to feed them a little bit to get some weight and condition on them, because you'll probably get more money, and it just might pay, and you might be able to do it just with forage. I do suspect people are buying cull ewes and trying to make money off of them. They used to do that a lot with cows, but sheep prices are awfully high that there's a lot of money in the cull ewes. And then if she's a productive female, you keep her. And hopefully that's who you pick your offspring from, your replacements from. And then during the rest of until you rebreed again, she's pretty much on a maintenance diet. Again, the ones that are on the thin side are going to need the opportunity to recover. And it may require some extra feeding, or you may separate a group out for extra feeding, or if there's a long enough period of time, they should easily be able to build back their body reserves. Last year, it probably took some extra feed in Maryland because of the drought conditions. And that concludes tonight's session. Again, happy to answer any questions, any comments.